A 17-year-old farm boy, a logging chain, and a German tank that never made it back. A German panzer was never meant to be destroyed this way. No gun, no bomb, no enemy fire. Yet in December 1944, one Panzer IV was ripped apart by nothing more than a steel chain because its crew made one fatal mistake. They drove uphill. The U.S. Army didn't train this tactic. It wasn't written in any field manual. In fact, no commander would have approved it, but a 17-year-old farm boy saw something the German tank crews didn't. December 15th, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A panzer column is advancing through the fog, confident, unopposed. Ahead of them sits a small American recovery post, none, combat troops, broken vehicles, no anti-tank weapons. To the Germans, it's an easy target. To James Washington, it's something else entirely. He doesn't see armor, he doesn't see a weapon, he sees weight. 25 tons of steel climbing a steep road with nowhere to maneuver. A machine depending on momentum to stay alive. Back home in Alabama, James learned one rule: moving heavy loads down hills. If a massive object is stopped suddenly on a slope, gravity doesn't help you. It turns against you, and whatever is holding that weight fails. That's the forbidden idea. James isn't trying to stop the tank. He's trying to let physics tear it apart. No shot is fired. No explosive detonates. When the chain goes tight, the panzer doesn't stall. It doesn't slide. It breaks. This is not a story about bravery. It's a story about a mistake German engineers never designed for, and a kind of knowledge the battlefield never respected. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war isn't a gun. It's understanding how heavy things fall. James Washington was not supposed to be there. At 17, he was too young for the army, too young for Europe, and certainly too young to be standing on a frozen Belgian hillside while German armor moved through the fog below. Officially, James was 18. Unofficially, everyone who worked beside him knew the truth. But in late 1944, the U.S. Army had stopped asking difficult questions. If you looked strong enough to work, you worked. And James did more than work. He was assigned to the 751st Tank Battalion, but not as a gunner, not as a driver, and not as a mechanic inside a Sherman. James belonged to a recovery detachment. His job was to deal with what the battlefield left behind. Broken trucks, disabled tanks, snapped axles, buried vehicles dragged into craters by artillery fire. It was dirty work, slow work, and almost always done far from the front line. Recovery crews didn't fight. They cleaned up after fighting was done, which was exactly why the position on Hill 212 was considered safe. The hill overlooked a narrow supply road winding through the Ardennes Forest, a road American planners believed was far behind the fighting. The recovery post was placed there for convenience, not defense. A wrecker truck, fuel cans, toolboxes, heavy chains coiled neatly near the clearing. No foxholes, no mines, no anti-tank weapons. James had spent the early morning of December 15th inspecting equipment the same way he always did. Hands moving over steel links, eyes checking for hairline cracks, deformed pins, stress points invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. This habit didn't come from the Army. It came from Alabama. Back home, James grew up in timber country. His family hauled logs down steep hills long before he was old enough to vote or legally enlist. By the time he was 8 years old, he knew what most men never learned: how weight behaves when gravity gets involved. In logging, mistakes don't forgive you. If a chain snaps, it doesn't just break, it whips. It kills. James learned to read slopes the way other boys read books. He could glance at a hill and tell you where a load would slide, where it would stall, and where it would tear itself apart if something went wrong. He understood tension not as a concept, but as a feeling, something you sensed through your hands before disaster arrived. That kind of knowledge didn't show up in military manuals, but it mattered. Captain Robert Morrison, James's commanding officer, noticed it almost immediately. While other soldiers followed procedures, James questioned angles. While others asked for heavier equipment, James asked where the weight was going. On more than one occasion, he recovered vehicles that should have required a tank or another truck using nothing but chains, pulleys, and geometry. Quietly, James became the man you called when nothing else worked. By December 1944, the war had changed. The Allies were advancing. Germany was supposed to be collapsing. Most American units believed the winter would slow operations, not reverse them. That assumption would be shattered the next morning when the German counteroffensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, exploded across the Ardennes. But on December 15th, one day before the offensive officially began, James and his small detachment didn't know any of that yet. What they did know was that something felt wrong. The fog that morning was thick, muffling sound and swallowing distance. The forest was quiet in the unnatural way that only comes before movement. James was near the wrecked truck when he heard it. A low mechanical rumble, steady and deliberate. Tracks, not American tracks. The sound was coming from the east. That alone made no sense. Friendly armor was positioned west and north. The eastern approaches were assumed clear. Sergeant O'Brien, the detachment's leader, raised his binoculars and moved toward the edge of the clearing. What he saw tightened his jaw. A German Panzer IV was climbing the road below them. Not stopped, not scouting, advancing, and it wasn't alone. Behind it, shapes moved in the fog. More armor, more steel, more certainty. A column that believed it was moving through friendly territory. A column that believed resistance would be light, if it existed at all. O'Brien understood the situation immediately. They were isolated. They were outgunned, and they had nothing capable of stopping a tank. The wrecker truck's 50 caliber machine gun was useless against armor. Rifles and carbines might as well have been insults. The radio crackled with incomplete transmissions, units reporting movement, confusion, contacts too scattered to piece together. Time was running out. 15 minutes, James estimated. That's how long it would take the lead panzer to reach the hilltop. While O'Brien weighed options, withdrawal, concealment, survival, James didn't look at the tank. He looked at the road, the slope, the switchbacks, the narrow sections where a vehicle had no room to turn. The panzer wasn't just advancing, it was climbing, and in James' mind something clicked. He didn't see a weapon. He didn't see armor. He saw mass. 25 tons of steel committing itself to gravity in the most vulnerable way possible. Uphill, constrained, dependent on momentum. To James Washington, it looked dangerously familiar, like a log being dragged where it didn't want to go. And for the first time since the rumble began, James realized something the German tank crews did not. They weren't in control of the hill. The hill was in control of them. The panzer did not slow down. It climbed with the steady confidence of a machine that believed nothing on that road could challenge it. The engine note was deep and controlled. The sound of torque being fed into steel tracks designed to crush earth, stone, and men alike. Black exhaust drifted into the fog as the vehicle leaned into the slope, each switchback bringing it closer to the hilltop. Sergeant O'Brien watched through his binoculars, already knowing the truth before he said it out loud. They were alone. The recovery post on Hill 2, 112, had never been meant to fight. It existed for convenience, not defense, a place to pull wrecks off the road, refuel, fix what could be fixed, and move on. The assumption behind its placement was simple. The front line was far away. That assumption was now rolling uphill on steel tracks. O'Brien turned to his men and spoke quickly, wasting no time on false reassurance. There were 4 of them, small arms only. 1 Browning automatic rifle, a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the wrecker truck, useful against infantry, meaningless against armor. The radio hissed and crackled. Units were calling in sightings, formed reports, fragments of a larger picture no one could yet see. German movement, unusual numbers, armor where it shouldn't be. This was no patrol. This was the beginning of something much larger. O'Brien laid out the options. They could abandon the post and retreat west through the forest, hoping the fog and terrain would hide them. But German infantry often followed armor, and fleeing uphill through snow and trees meant exhaustion, exposure, and a very real chance of being cut down. They could hide and hope the panzer column passed by without investigating the hilltop, but the recovery equipment, fuel stores, and vehicles were visible. The Germans would see them, and when they did, capture or execution was likely, or they could stay and face a tank with nothing capable of stopping it. None of the options were good. James listened without speaking. He was still watching the road. The Panzer reached the first switchback, its tracks biting into frozen dirt as the driver adjusted throttle and steering with practiced precision. This crew knew what they were doing. They had climbed worse terrain than this in France and Russia. To them, Hill 212 was not a threat. It was an inconvenience. James estimated distance automatically 800 m. At the tank's current speed, it would reach the summit in roughly 15 minutes. 15 minutes, that was the number that mattered. O'Brien dismissed Corporal Chen and Private Rodriguez to begin preparing for withdrawal if it came to that, gathering essential gear, checking weapons, marking potential routes through the trees. The sergeant himself remained near the road, binoculars fixed on the advancing armor, his mind turning through scenarios that all ended the same way. James stayed where he was, near the chains. The recovery chains lay coiled beside the clearing, each link forged thick and heavy, built to drag disabled tanks out of mud and shell holes. James had inspected them that morning out of habit. He knew their rating, 50 tons under ideal conditions, less if shock-loaded, much less if abused. He knelt beside one coil and ran his glove along the steel. In his mind, the Panzer was no longer a tank. It was a load. Back home, loads killed people when you misjudged them. James's father had drilled that lesson into him long before the army ever did. When you moved timber down a slope, you never fought gravity. You worked with it or you died. A log weighing several tons behaved predictably until the moment it didn't. When movement stopped suddenly on an incline, all the stored energy had to go somewhere. Usually it went into the chain, and when the chain failed, it failed violently. James had seen snapped chains carve through trees. He had seen steel links tear loose and whip through the air with enough force to kill a man instantly. He had learned to respect tension as something alive, something that built quietly and punished mistakes without mercy. That knowledge followed him now, uninvited but unavoidable. The Panzer reached the second switchback, 600 m. The road here narrowed, hugging the hillside where the slope dropped sharply into a wooded valley. There was little room to maneuver. A tank committed to this climb could not easily turn around. Reversing under fire or under stress was dangerous even in training. James could see it clearly now. The tank's rear suspension was bearing more and more weight as it climbed. The steeper the grade, the more gravity worked against it. The more the crew relied on momentum to keep moving forward. In logging terms, the Panzer was in the worst possible position. O'Brien noticed James kneeling by the chains and frowned. "What are you doing?" he asked. James didn't answer right away. He stood, brushed snow from his gloves, and looked at the road again. His eyes traced the slope, the angle, the curve of the switchback where the grade was steepest. 200 m below the clearing, that was the spot. If the tank was stopped there, if its forward motion was arrested suddenly, gravity would do the rest. The weight would surge backward, the stress would spike. And if something resisted that stress, James turned to O'Brien. "Sergeant," he said, keeping his voice low, "that tank can't turn around on that road." "Doc." O'Brien nodded. "I know, quote, if you just a vivivor all, and if it stops on the steep part." James continued, "It's not just stopping. All that weight is still pulling." Wing O'Brien studied him. "What are you saying?" "Maybe," says James, pointed downhill. "Where that switchback tightens, that's the steepest grade. If something locks the tank there, hard gravity is going to fight the transmission." End quote. The sergeant frowned deeper. "With what? We don't have anything that can lock a Panzer. It's not roaded." James looked at the chains again. "We do," he said, for a moment. O'Brien thought the kid was joking. Chains didn't stop tanks. Chains were for recovery, not combat. The idea sounded reckless, borderline suicidal. You didn't put obstacles in front of a tank unless you wanted to be shot to pieces. But James wasn't talking about blocking the tank. He was talking about letting it block itself. James explained quickly, using the dirt at his feet to sketch angles and forces with a stick. He talked about tension, about momentum, about what happened when a heavy load was stopped suddenly on a slope. He explained how the record truck's winch could multiply force using pulleys, how the chain didn't need to be stronger than the tank, just strong enough to let gravity finish the job. O'Brien listened in silence. The Panzer reached the third switchback. 400 m behind it, more armor loomed in the fog. This was no lone vehicle. This was the tip of a column. If the lead tank reached the summit intact, Hill 2, 112 would be lost. And once the Germans controlled the high ground, nothing would stop them from rolling through the supply routes beyond. O'Brien weighed the options again. Run and die tired, hide and be captured, or try something the army would never approve. The plan sounded insane, but it was the only one that didn't end immediately. Timing, O'Brien asked. James didn't hesitate. It has to be exact. Too early, they stop. Too late, it passes the point. If, how much time to Valabon? James watched the tank climb, calculating speed against distance. 3 seconds, he said. From the signal to full tension, 1 quote. O'Brien exhaled slowly. 3 seconds was nothing, but 15 minutes were almost gone. The Panzer was 200 m away now, climbing toward the steepest part of the road. The fog thinned just enough to reveal the full shape of it. Angular armor plates, the long gun barrel steady and calm, the confidence of a machine that believed itself untouchable. O'Brien made his decision. Get the chain, he said, and in that moment Hill 2, 112 stopped being a recovery post. It became a trap. Once Sergeant O'Brien gave the order, there was no room left for doubt. This was no longer a theory, no longer a thought experiment pulled from a farm boy's memory. They were going to test it. Against a German Panzer, James moved first, not because he outranked anyone, but because he was the only one who knew exactly what had to happen. He grabbed the heavy recovery chain and felt its weight settle into his arms. 400 lb of steel links, each one thick enough to crush fingers, each one capable of killing if mishandled. He didn't rush. In logging, rushing was how people died. James signaled to Corporal Chen, who joined him without questions. Chen was trained as an engineer, but nothing in his textbooks had prepared him for what he was about to help build. Still, he understood enough to see that James wasn't guessing. There was a structure to his thinking, a logic grounded in force and geometry rather than desperation. They dragged the chain downhill, staying low, using the trees and the fog to mask their movement. The sound of steel scraping against frozen ground made James WSC, but the rumble of the Panzer's engine swallowed most of it. The tank was closer now, 150 m. The road curved sharply left at the steepest part of the climb. James stopped there, breath fogging in the cold air, and studied the surface. Frozen dirt packed hard by repeated traffic. Just enough traction for steel tracks, but not enough margin for error. This was the point of maximum commitment. Once the tank reached this bend, reversing would be slow and dangerous. The driver would have to fight gravity, traction, loss, and limited visibility. Any sudden resistance here would place enormous strain on the drivetrain. James nodded to Chen. This is it. Grum, grum. They positioned the chain carefully across the road, not stretched tight. Not yet. Most of its length was coiled uphill, hidden from view, ready to be pulled into place at the exact moment James would signal. The chain itself was not meant to block the tank like a wall. It was meant to become a sudden, unyielding stop, one that the tank's momentum would slam into before the crew could react. Meanwhile, back at the clearing, Sergeant O'Brien and Private Rodriguez worked the anchor system. The wrecker truck was parked at an angle, its engine idling low. Winch cable already fed through a system of pulleys anchored to trees and reinforced with additional chains. Each pulley multiplied force. Each angle had been calculated quickly but carefully. James had explained it in simple terms. You don't need more power, he'd said. You need leverage, end quote. With the pulleys rigged, the wrecker's winch would deliver far more force to the recovery chain than the motor could produce on its own. Enough to hold tension, enough to resist gravity briefly, enough to let physics do the rest. O'Brien checked, set up one last time, his jaw tight. This wasn't doctrine. This wasn't training. This was improvisation. At the edge of disaster, the Panzer rounded the final switchback below them. 100 m inside the German tank. Weber felt no threat. His crew had advanced into far worse conditions in Russia. Narrow roads, frozen ground, ambushes from forests that hid entire divisions. This hill was nothing. A minor objective, a routine climb. Through his periscope, Weber saw American equipment scattered at the summit trucks. Fuel cans, crates, no fortifications, no gun emplacements. Exactly what intelligence had predicted. Maintain speed, he ordered calmly. Driver Hoffman kept the throttle steady, tracks gripping as the tank leaned into the climb. He was aware of the slope, but unconcerned. The Panzer IV was designed for this. The engine responded smoothly. The transmission held. Everything felt normal. That was the danger. James lay prone beside the road, watching the tank approach through the fog. Every sense was focused. He tracked the rotation of the tracks, the pitch of the engine, the distance closing second by second. He wasn't thinking about fear. He was thinking about timing. 3 seconds, that was all the margin they had. If he signaled too early, the tank would stop short. The crew would see the chain. They would reverse, call for infantry, bring up artillery. The moment would be lost. If he signaled too late, the tank would pass the critical point. Grade would lessen. Gravity's leverage would weaken. The entire plan would fail. James counted in his head. The tank was 40 m out. 30-25. He raised his hand. 15 m. James dropped his hand sharply. Back at the clearing, O'Brien didn't hesitate. He slammed the winch control forward. The truck's engine roared as the winch engaged, pulling the recovery chain uphill with explosive force. The pulley screamed under the sudden load, steel biting into steel, tension building faster than the human eye could track. The chain snapped taut across the road. The Panzer hit it almost immediately. The impact was violent. Inside the tank, the sudden deceleration hurled the crew forward against their harnesses and controls. Hoffman instinctively tried to brake and reverse, but the reaction came too late. The tank's forward momentum was already gone, replaced by something far worse. For a brief moment, no more than 2 seconds, the Panzer sat motionless against the chain. That moment was the point of no return. The tank's engine continued to push forward. Gravity pulled backward. The winch pulled downhill. Forces converged in ways the vehicle had never been designed to withstand. The transmission screamed. Metal groaned. James watched. His breath held. The tank's tracks spun uselessly, unable to gain traction. Hoffman fought the controls, trying to back down the hill, but the drivetrain was already under catastrophic stress. The chain wasn't just holding the tank, it was concentrating force at exactly the wrong place. The Panzer's own weight became its enemy. The transmission housing cracked first, not visibly, not yet, but internally where the metal was weakest. The sudden reverse load overwhelmed components meant to handle gradual changes, not shock. Forces multiplied by gravity and mechanical advantage. Then the chain began to bite. Under more than 50 tons of tension, the steel links pressed into the Panzer sidearm. 30 mm of steel designed to deflect shells was never meant to resist sustained pressure at a single point. The armor started to deform inside the tank. Alarms sounded. Systems failed one after another. Electrical lines severed. Hydraulic pressure dropped. The radio went dead. Weber shouted orders that no longer mattered. The tank wasn't being attacked. It was being torn apart. The chain cut deeper, grinding into the hull. With relentless force, the Panzer lurched as structural elements began to fail in sequence, each failure increasing stress on the next. James could hear it now, a deep tearing sound that carried even over the engine noise, metal separating. The critical failure came suddenly with a violent crack. The structural integrity of the hull gave way. The front section of the tank driver's compartment and transmission sheared away from the rear. The Panzer split. The front half slid backward down the slope. No longer connected to the engine, its tracks spinning freely as gravity claimed it. It bounced off rocks and trees, disappearing into the fog-filled valley below. The rear section remained on the road, engine still running, immobilized and useless. Silence followed. The wrecker truck strained for a moment longer. Then O'Brien cut the winch. James lay still, staring at the wreckage. He hadn't imagined this. He hadn't hoped for it, but it had worked. Not because of luck, not because of bravery, because weight behaves the same way everywhere on an Alabama hillside or a Belgian road. And as the fog closed in again around Hill 212, James understood something else, something even more dangerous. This had been a surprise, and surprises only work once. For several seconds after the Panzer split, no one moved. Not James, not Sergeant O'Brien, not the men on the hill, and certainly not the Germans below. The road lay silent except for the low, meaningless rumble of the Panzer's engine still running in the rear half of the tank. Thick black smoke drifted upward, curling into the fog as if the machine itself didn't yet understand it was dead. James pushed himself up slowly. The chain lay slack now, scarred and hot, but intact. The steel links had bitten into armor and won. He had never seen anything like it. Not in Alabama, not in training, not in his worst or best imagination. But his first thought wasn't pride, it was time, because the tank had not been alone. Sergeant O'Brien was already moving, snapping orders low and fast. Positions. Use the wreck for cover. Eyes downhill, 1. The split Panzer was now a monument of confusion. A destroyed machine blocking the road in a way no shell crater ever could. It wasn't burning. It hadn't exploded. It simply failed. That was the problem. From the perspective of the German column below, something impossible had just happened. 200 m downhill, the 2nd Panzer slowed. Its commander, Lieutenant Richter, had been following at a cautious distance, maintaining spacing in case of mines or ambush, when the radio went silent from the lead tank. Artur felt a tightening in his chest. Radio failures happened, but not like this. Then he saw debris, not the scattered wreckage of a shell hit, not flames, not smoke from a penetration, just parts, steel fragments. A track section twisted at an unnatural angle. Fresh gouges torn into the road surface. Stop, Artur ordered. His driver braked, tracks grinding to a halt. The column froze inside Artur's tank. The crew stared through optics and periscopes, trying to understand what they were seeing. The lead Panzer was no longer whole. The front half was gone, missing entirely. No enemy fire had announced itself. No muzzle flashes, no explosions. The tank looked like it had been pulled apart. Artur radioed Major Miller farther back in the column. Lead vehicle disabled, cause unknown, end quote. Mueller demanded clarification. Artur had none to give from the hilltop. James watched the 2nd Panzer stop. This was the moment he'd feared. The first trap had worked. Because the Germans had been confident, because they had assumed superiority, because they had driven forward without hesitation. That was over. Now they were alert, and a second chance would be harder. O'Brien crouched beside James. "We can't do that again," he said quietly. "They'll see it coming." Every two, James nodded. The chain was in the wrong place now anyway. The road geometry that had made the first trap perfect couldn't be repeated without repositioning everything, and that meant exposure. Exposure meant death, but James wasn't done thinking. He studied the disabled tank below. Then the 2nd Panzer behind it. He watched the way the German commander edged forward, cautious now, gun traversing, scanning the trees. James realized something critical. The Germans didn't know what had happened, only that it was bad, and uncertainty in armored warfare was dangerous. If they didn't understand the threat, they couldn't counter it. James's mind raced, not forward but sideways. The first trap had used gravity and tension to tear the tank apart longitudinally front to back. That required commitment, momentum, steep grade. The 2nd tank wasn't giving him that, but it didn't need to, because tanks had another weakness. Tracks. The recovery chain didn't have to stop the tank, it only had to bind it. James leaned close to O'Brien. "I can still use the chain," he said, "but not like before, just of that." O'Brien studied his face. "How if that was stuck side load?" James replied. "If it catches the track while it's turning, the stress goes sideways. Track comes off. Transmission takes the hit." "Well," O'Brien frowned, "that's a guess. 17. James shook his head. "I've seen it with logging trucks. Wheels bind, axles snap. Same principle. Melters and Felders. They didn't have time to debate. The second panzer began moving again, inching forward, gun covering the tree line. Artur was advancing slowly now, scanning for mines, infantry, anything that explained the destruction ahead. James crawled back toward the wrecker truck. The chain was still usable. The winch still worked, and the road still curved. James signaled to Corporal Chen, who was already reading his body language. Together, they repositioned part of the chain off the road, hiding it behind debris and snow, leaving just enough slack to be dragged laterally. This wasn't about brute force anymore. It was about timing. The second panzer crept forward, its commander cautious but under pressure. Major Muller wanted answers. Stopping indefinitely wasn't an option. The offensive timetable was tight. Every minute mattered. Artur eased the tank forward as it reached the debris field left by the first panzer. He slowed further, peering through his optics. He could see the rear half of the destroyed tank still blocking part of the road. No flams, no impact scars, just steel torn in ways he didn't understand. Advance, Mueller ordered over the radio. Clear the obstruction. Menina, it's Artur obeyed. James waited. He counted track rotations. He watched the angle of the hull as the tank began negotiating a slight bend in the road exactly where lateral stress would peak. This time he didn't signal early. He waited until the last possible moment when the panzer's left track was fully committed into the turn. James gave the signal. O'Brien engaged the winch. The chain snapped sideways across the road. It didn't hit the hull. It hit the track. The effect was immediate. The heavy steel links jammed between the moving track and the frozen ground, creating a sudden lateral bind that the suspension and drive sprocket were never designed to handle. The track derailed violently, climbing off its guide teeth and snapping free from its alignment. Inside the tank, Artur felt the jolt and shouted to his driver, but it was already over. The left track came off completely. The panzer lurched, tilted, and ground to a halt. Immobilized, the transmission screamed again, not with the catastrophic violence of the first tank, but with enough damage to render the vehicle useless. The engine still ran. The gun still worked, but the tank could not move. From a weapon of maneuver, it had become a stationary bunker. 2 tanks disabled. No visible enemy fire, no anti-tank guns. The psychological impact was immediate. Major Muller realized something was terribly wrong. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. The Americans were doing something his training had not prepared him for. He ordered the column to halt completely. From the hilltop, James could see German infantry dismounting from half-tracks farther down the road, spreading into the trees, probing cautiously. The element of surprise was gone. O'Brien gathered his men behind the wrecked panzer hull, using its thick armor as cover. "That's it," he said. "No more tricks. We're quieted." James nodded. He knew it too. The chain had bought them time, but time was all it ever could buy. German artillery would come next, or engineers or infantry with explosives. The hill would not stay quiet for long, and sure enough, 40 minutes later, the first shells began to fall. German artillery bracketed Hill 212, pounding the clearing with high explosive rounds that sent dirt, snow, and shrapnel flying. James huddled behind the tank wreckage as the earth shook, the noise overwhelming, the air thick with dust and smoke. They survived only because the bombardment was brief. German shells were precious. The offensive demanded them elsewhere. When the shelling stopped, the forest went eerily silent again. Then engines from the west, American engines, Sherman tanks broke through the trees, followed by infantry. Reinforcements late, battered but alive. The hill was saved, but the damage was done. 3 German tanks had been neutralized or destroyed on that road, and no one in the German column could explain how. James sat against the cold steel of the ruined panzer, hands shaking now that the adrenaline was gone. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't thrown a grenade, yet the road below was blocked by wreckage and fear. And for the first time that day, James understood the true weight of what he'd done, not just to a tank, but to the enemy's confidence, because tanks were supposed to be unstoppable. And today a chain had proven otherwise. The German column did not advance again that day. Major Muller stood inside his command tank, staring at a road that had turned hostile without warning. 3 armored vehicles were now either destroyed or immobilized along a stretch of hillside that intelligence had marked as lightly defended. There were no visible minefields, no anti-tank guns, no wrecked American armor littering the approach, only chains, debris, and unanswered questions. German doctrine depended on clarity. Identify the threat, apply overwhelming force, advance, but Hill 212 offered no clarity. Whatever had disabled the lead, Panzer had done so silently. No muzzle flashes, no explosions, no obvious signature that could be countered with artillery or maneuver. The second tank's immobilization only deepened the uncertainty. The crews could not agree on what had happened, only that something invisible had torn their machines apart. That uncertainty was lethal. Mueller radioed higher headquarters and reported the situation as best he could. His message sounded absurd, even to his own ears. Tanks disabled by mechanical stress, tracks torn free, hull failure. Without penetration, the response from above was cautious. Investigate, hold position, preserve remaining armor. The timetable mattered. The German offensive depended on speed breaking through thin American lines before reinforcements could respond. Every delay allowed the Allies to recover, to move reserves to stabilize the front. Hill 212 had become a delay. While the Germans hesitated, American units were already reacting. The Sherman platoon that arrived on the hill did not come in triumph. They arrived exhausted, damaged, and weary, having fought their way through confusion, miscommunication, and scattered resistance. Lieutenant Taylor, the platoon commander, surveyed the scene in disbelief. A panzer split cleanly in two, another disabled without visible impact damage, a third blocked by wreckage. Taylor had been trained to recognize battlefield signatures. This was not one of them, Sergeant O'Brien explained quickly. Not dramatically. Not heroically, just facts, chains, winch, slope. Taylor listened, skeptical at first, then silent. He walked the road himself, examined the torn steel, the gouges in the hole where lynx had bitten in. He ran his hand along the damage and shook his head. This shouldn't work, he said. Finally, it does, O'Brien replied. Taylor didn't argue. Instead, he adapted. Sherman tanks were positioned to cover the approach. Guns trained downhill, overlapping fields of fire set to punish any renewed German advance. Infantry dug in around the hilltop using the wrecked panzer hulls as improvised fortifications. What had been a recovery post that morning was now a defensive strong point, and the Germans could see it. Mueller's reconnaissance confirmed the arrival of American armor. The narrow road that had seemed like a convenient axis of advance was now a liability. Tanks could not deploy freely. Infantry would have to clear the flanks under fire. Artillery support was limited by ammunition shortages and competing priorities across the front. The calculus had changed. Mueller made the decision that would end the engagement. He withdrew not in panic, not in defeat, but in recognition that Hill 212 was no longer worth the cost. The German column backed away, regrouping for operations elsewhere. Operations that would now be slower, more cautious, and less effective than planned. The road remained blocked. The delay spread outward. Elsewhere along the Ardennes front, similar delays compounded. Units that should have been overrun held longer than expected. American commanders gained hours, sometimes days, to reposition forces and stabilize the line. Hill 212 was only one point on the map, but wars were not lost at once. They were bled away in moments like this. For James Washington, the aftermath was quiet. There was no celebration, no immediate recognition, no dramatic speeches. He returned the recovery chains to their proper place and checked them for damage, just as he had that morning. They would be needed again for their intended purpose. The army did not rush to formalize what had happened. The tactic was too situational, too dependent on terrain and equipment. There would be no chain doctrine, no training manual explaining how to rip tanks apart with logging gear. But the lesson was recorded after action reports moved up the chain of command. Engineers studied the damage. Armor officers debated the implications. Quietly, the engagement at Hill 212 entered the growing body of evidence that rigid doctrine could not account for every battlefield reality, especially when civilians brought their own knowledge to war. James received a commendation weeks later, brief, understated, and carefully worded. It praised initiative, mechanical insight, calm under pressure. It did not mention split tanks. He didn't talk about it much afterward either. To James, nothing he had done felt extraordinary. He hadn't invented a weapon. He hadn't broken physics. He had applied rules he'd learned before he ever wore a uniform. Heavy things behaved the same way everywhere, on a timber slope in Alabama or a frozen road in Belgium. What changed was the context. The Germans had believed their machines were invincible because they were designed to defeat known threats, guns, shells, explosives. They had not designed them to fight gravity used correctly, and that was the mistake. Not arrogance, not carelessness, but assumption. The assumption that only soldiers could hurt tanks, that only weapons could stop armor, that battlefield knowledge began and ended in military schools. James Washington proved otherwise. The damage he caused that day was not measured in wrecked vehicles alone. It was measured in hesitation, in uncertainty, in the sudden realization that superiority meant nothing if you didn't understand the environment you were moving through. For the rest of the Battle of the Bulge, German units advanced more cautiously on narrow roads and steep terrain. Engineers were sent forward more often. Reconnaissance slowed movements. Every delay favored the defenders. The offensive never regained its momentum. And while historians would later point to fuel shortages, weather, and overwhelming Allied production as the true causes of Germany's failure, those explanations overlooked something smaller, but just as decisive. Momentum dies when confidence dies. On Hill 212, confidence died without a shot being fired. A tank was not defeated by firepower. It was defeated by weight, and a 17-year-old farm boy standing beside a pile of chains understood that better than anyone else on the battlefield. James Washington never asked the army to remember what happened on Hill 212. After the road fell quiet and the German column withdrew, he went back to work. The chains were recoiled, the wrecker truck refueled. Damaged vehicles were tagged and logged the way they always were. To James, the battlefield didn't feel different. It felt solved. The war, however, did remember, not loudly, not in headlines, but in reports, memos, and quiet conversations between officers who couldn't quite explain what they'd seen. A German panzer had not been destroyed by firepower. It had been destroyed by physics, and that distinction mattered. In the months that followed, American engineers studied photographs of the wreckage. They traced stress lines across torn steel. They calculated forces that no shell trajectory could replicate. German engineers did the same on the other side, trying to understand how a machine built to survive direct hits had failed without being hit at all. Both sides reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. The tank hadn't failed because it was poorly designed. It had failed because it was used in a way its designers never imagined. Every weapon is built to defeat a known threat. Almost none are built to survive the unknown one. James Washington never became a tank killer. He didn't spend the rest of the war hunting armor with chains. The conditions that made Hill 212 possible were rare, specific terrain, specific equipment, specific timing. The Army understood that. But what the Army did take from Hill 212 was far more important. Civilian knowledge mattered. The war had pulled millions of men into uniform farmers, mechanics, miners, loggers, machinists. Many of them carried skills that never appeared in doctrine, never showed up in manuals, and were never tested on firing ranges. Yet, when the rules broke down, those skills often mattered more than rank or training. James' understanding of weight, tension, and leverage didn't come from a classroom. It came from watching chains fail and learning why, from seeing what happened when gravity was ignored, from surviving mistakes that didn't forgive you twice. On Hill 212, that knowledge crossed a boundary no one expected. It turned a road into a weapon. It turned momentum into a liability. It turned confidence into hesitation. The German offensive didn't fail because of one broken tank or even three. It failed because it lost speed, and speed is life in war. Every minute a column